The funeral was supposed to be my final goodbye to the father I believed had abandoned me. Instead, it ended with a sealed letter in my hands. A letter written by the man I hadn't heard from in 7 years. I thought it contained his last words. I had no idea it was about to expose a secret powerful enough to destroy everything I believed about my family. For 7 years, Emily Holloway believed her father had chosen his new family over his own daughter. But one handwritten letter would change everything. Hidden behind silence, betrayal, and a billionaire's final instructions was a mystery decades in the making. A forensic accountant who never guessed. A billionaire who spent 7 years preparing for a battle he knew he might never live to see. A woman whose patterns stretched across decades, and a family destroyed by a truth that arrived far too late. As forgotten journals, hidden shell companies, and one impossible timeline begin to connect, Emily discovers that justice isn't always about proving who committed the crime. Sometimes it's about understanding why no one saw it until it was almost too late. Before this story is over, Emily will discover that the greatest lie wasn't what her father said, it was what he was forced to hide. Before we dive in, if this is your first time here, welcome. This story continues directly from part 1, so if you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend starting there first. It'll help you understand every clue, every twist, and every secret that's about to unfold. If you enjoy psychological mysteries, suspense, and thrilling stories that keep you guessing until the very end, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your theories in the comments below. Now, let's uncover what Richard Holloway's final letter was really trying to reveal. Previously on The Daughter They Uninvited. 7 years after being cast out by her father, Emily Holloway returned to attend the funeral of billionaire Richard Holloway. She believed he had abandoned her after she uncovered suspicious financial irregularities inside Holloway Manufacturing. At the funeral, Emily found herself treated like a stranger by the family that had replaced her. Just as she prepared to leave after saying her final goodbye, the estate attorney stopped her. Following Richard Holloway's personal instructions, he placed a sealed handwritten letter into her hands, explaining it was to be delivered only after the funeral had ended. As Emily stared at the familiar handwriting she hadn't seen in 7 long years, she realized she was holding more than her father's final message. Without knowing it, she was holding the first clue to a mystery that would change her life forever. The 2 years that followed were not cinematic in the way the funeral itself had been. They were slower, procedural, made almost entirely of depositions and forensic accountants, and a private investigator my father had quietly retained 18 months before his death, whose files, once unsealed, traced Renata's pattern back nearly 20 years, through 2 prior marriages under 2 different names in 2 different states, each one ending in a sudden, convenient inheritance dispute that had somehow always resolved in her favor before anyone thought to look closely enough. The headlines came quickly. The truth did not. Within 48 hours of the funeral, every major business publication in the state had picked up some version of the story. Most of them focused on the inheritance. Some focused on the recording played inside St. Miriam's. Others speculated about the future of Holloway Manufacturing, wondering whether the daughter the public believed had been disowned was now prepared to run one of the region's largest manufacturing companies. None of them knew the real story. Neither did I. The estate attorney advised me not to speak publicly. Every sentence you say now, he warned, becomes evidence for someone. So I remained silent. For once, silence wasn't forced upon me. It was strategy. The investigation occupied nearly every day that followed. Conference rooms replaced church pews. Financial reports replaced sympathy cards. Instead of flowers, every table seemed covered with stacks of contracts, bank statements, transfer records, and corporate filings stretching back almost a decade. I sat through most of those meetings myself. Not because anyone expected me to, because I needed to understand what my father had spent 7 years trying to expose. The first time investigators placed the complete Meridian Holdings file in front of me, I was surprised less by its size than by its precision. Every transfer had been documented, every meeting recorded, every suspicious signature compared against authenticated samples. My father hadn't merely suspected fraud. He had prepared for war. The private investigator he'd hired had worked almost entirely alone, reporting only to my father through a personal account Renata couldn't access. His notes were meticulous. Dates, times, license plate numbers, Photographs of meetings Preston believed no one had witnessed. Copies of documents quietly obtained before they could disappear. It became painfully obvious why my father had remained silent for so long. He hadn't been waiting for proof. He had been building a case impossible to destroy. The investigation expanded almost weekly. What initially appeared to be a financial dispute slowly revealed something much darker. Renata's history refused to remain buried. Different names, different addresses, different marriages. Yet somehow the same financial patterns appeared every single time. Companies quietly reorganized. Ownership transferred through shell corporations. Assets disappearing so gradually that no single transaction appeared suspicious on its own. Viewed separately, they looked ordinary. Viewed together, they formed a blueprint. I attended the first major deposition nearly 3 months after the funeral. The room felt strangely ordinary. A rectangular table, bottled water, legal pads. Nothing about it suggested lives were about to change forever. Renata entered wearing the same composed expression she had worn outside St. Miriam's. Perfectly tailored suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence. If I hadn't known everything uncovered during the previous weeks, I might have believed she was simply a widow exhausted by unnecessary accusations. She answered every question calmly, never raising her voice, never appearing frustrated. She described herself as a supportive wife who trusted her husband's judgment completely. She claimed financial matters had always been Preston's responsibility. She insisted she had never concerned herself with corporate ownership structures. Listening to her speak, I almost admired the discipline. Almost. Because every sentence sounded believable. That was what made it dangerous. Truth and lies often use exactly the same tone. The investigators, however, weren't interested in tone. They were interested in documents. And documents, don't forget. Near the end of the afternoon, one of the attorneys quietly placed 3 printed emails onto the table. I watched Renata's eyes settle on the first page. For the first time since entering the room, she stopped speaking. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. The email contained a simple question she had personally sent my father years earlier regarding Meridian Holdings, a company she had just spent 3 hours claiming she knew almost nothing about. The room changed instantly. No one raised their voice. No one celebrated. Experienced investigators understand that the moment a carefully rehearsed story begins collapsing is often the moment silence becomes the most effective weapon. Renata finally looked up. Gone was the certainty she'd carried through the deposition. For the first time, she appeared to understand something my father had known years earlier. Patience eventually defeats performance. And Richard Holloway had been far more patient than either she or Preston had ever imagined. There was a particular afternoon, midway through that second year, when one of the forensic accountants, a quiet man named Arthur who had clearly done this kind of work for decades and long since stopped being surprised by any of it, walked me through the full 20-year pattern on a whiteboard, marriage by marriage, each husband's cause of death listed beside his name in small, careful handwriting. The conference room felt unusually quiet. Arthur wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't believe in sensational language. He believed in evidence. And evidence, when presented patiently enough, had a way of becoming impossible to argue with. He uncapped a black marker and drew 3 names across the top of the whiteboard. 3 husbands, 3 marriages, 3 different surnames, 3 different states. At first glance, they appeared completely unrelated. Different years, different businesses, different financial institutions, different attorneys. Only one thing connected them: Renata, or rather, the woman who would eventually become Renata Holloway. Each marriage ended almost the same way. A husband became unexpectedly wealthy. Ownership structures quietly changed. Small shell companies appeared around existing assets. Then came an illness, or what had been recorded as one. Natural causes: heart failure, a sudden stroke, an unexpected medical emergency. Arthur pointed toward the timeline. Individually, he said quietly, none of these deaths raised enough concern to justify reopening the investigations. He paused before continuing. But together, he let the sentence disappear. He didn't need to finish it. The whiteboard completed it for him. 2 of the 3 prior deaths, he told me gently, had never been formally investigated as anything other than natural causes, though both, in hindsight, occurred within 18 months of a similarly structured shell company reaching full maturity. He was careful, in that conversation, never to say the word he was clearly avoiding, and I understood, sitting there in that conference room, why the state's attorney had ultimately decided not to pursue additional charges beyond financial fraud. Some doors, once opened decades later, simply cannot be proven shut again with any certainty. I looked back toward the first name on the board, then the second, finally, the third, Richard Halloway. A cold feeling settled somewhere beneath my ribs. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether my father had been protecting the company. Perhaps he'd also been protecting himself. Arthur seemed to read the thought before I spoke it. "We don't investigate possibilities," he said carefully. "We investigate evidence." I nodded. He was right. But possibility has a way of lingering long after evidence runs out, especially when the people involved are no longer alive to answer questions. There was another detail I couldn't ignore. Each husband had trusted her completely. Every one of them. No warning signs. No public disputes. No dramatic confrontations. From the outside, each marriage appeared successful. That, more than anything, disturbed me. Because deception rarely announces itself. It simply waits until trust becomes routine. Arthur erased part of the whiteboard. Only one name remained. Richard Halloway. "He changed the pattern," Arthur said. "He saw it before she finished." Those words struck me harder than anything else I'd heard that afternoon. My father hadn't simply uncovered financial fraud. He had interrupted a pattern that had apparently worked for decades, which meant something else became painfully obvious. If I had never discovered the Meridian irregularities 7 years earlier, Richard might never have started looking. If Richard never started looking, he never would have built the case. And if he never built the case, history might have repeated itself one more time. The realization left me speechless. For years, I believed my discovery destroyed my family. Now I understood it may have saved what remained of it. Arthur quietly gathered the documents spread across the table. Before leaving the room, he paused beside the door. "Your father understood something most people don't." I looked up. He knew criminals eventually become prisoners of their own patterns. Arthur gave a small nod. They stopped believing anyone else can see them. After he left, I remained alone in the conference room for nearly an hour. The whiteboard had been erased. The files had been boxed away. Yet I couldn't stop staring at the empty wall where those 3 names had been written. Some mysteries end with answers. Others end with understanding. They aren't always the same thing. And somewhere deep inside, I realized the most dangerous person my father had ever investigated wasn't sitting in a corporate office. She had been sitting across his own dinner table all along. The deposition I remember most clearly took place on a Thursday in late autumn, nearly 14 months after the funeral, when Renata's own attorney made the mistake of asking her, directly, on the record, whether she had ever discussed Meridian Holdings with my father before his death. She answered immediately. No. There wasn't the slightest hesitation. No uncertainty. No glance toward her attorney. Just one confident word. For a brief moment, I almost admired the certainty. Then I remembered something my father used to tell every junior accountant during their first week. The most dangerous lie isn't the complicated one. It's the simple one. Because simple lies leave nowhere to hide. The court reporter continued typing. The attorneys remained expressionless. No one reacted. Experienced litigators rarely interrupt someone while they're making a mistake. They simply allow it to become permanent. Renata folded her hands neatly on the table. To anyone watching casually, she looked composed, almost relaxed. She had spent more than a year answering questions. She understood the rhythm. Question. Answer. Pause. Repeat. What she didn't know was that the prosecution had stopped asking questions they didn't already know the answers to weeks earlier. The lead attorney quietly reached into a folder. No dramatic flourish. No accusation. He simply removed a single printed email. 1 page. Nothing more. "I'd like to mark Exhibit 42. The bailiff handed copies around the room. One eventually reached me. I looked down. The date caught my attention first. For years before my father died. Long before the dinner. Long before I discovered the irregularities. Long before anyone supposedly knew Meridian Holdings existed. The attorney waited until everyone had finished reading. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Halloway, would you please read the highlighted sentence aloud?" For the first time that afternoon, Renata hesitated. Only briefly, but everyone noticed. She adjusted her glasses, looked down again, then began reading. Do the Meridian numbers look healthy enough to discuss with the board during dinner next week? The room became perfectly still. The attorney nodded. And who wrote that email? Silence. He repeated the question. Mrs. Holloway. Who wrote that email? Finally, she answered. I did. Another pause. And who were you asking? My husband. The same Meridian Holdings you testified, under oath, that you knew nothing about? No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe. Renata looked toward her attorney. He didn't rescue her. He couldn't. The document spoke for itself. My father's reply appeared directly beneath hers. 3 words. Not yet, dear. Nothing more. Nothing less. Those 3 words changed everything. Because they proved something far more important than simple knowledge. My father already knew she was interested in Meridian. He simply hadn't revealed how much he already suspected. The prosecution placed another document beside the first. Then another. Then another. Emails. Meeting schedules. Authorization requests. Board memorandums carrying Renata's own comments in the margins. Individually, each document seemed harmless. Together, they became impossible to explain away. I watched the confidence slowly disappear from her face. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like someone realizing a bridge had collapsed behind them one step at a time. Her attorney requested a short recess. The judge agreed. People quietly stood. Conversations immediately began in whispers around the courtroom. I remained seated. There was nothing left to say. For 14 months, I'd watched investigators patiently assemble pieces that seemed meaningless by themselves. Now every piece had found its place. Arthur happened to pass my table during the recess. He smiled faintly. Your father always said accounting isn't about numbers. It's about patterns. I nodded. And lies. He looked back toward Renata. Lies create patterns too. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. Renata answered very few questions after that. Most responses became variations of the same phrase. I don't recall. I don't remember. I'd have to review the document. Memory had suddenly become very selective. Unfortunately for her, the emails remembered everything. Watching the evidence unfold, I finally understood why my father had waited 7 years. Not because he lacked courage. Because incomplete truth can lose to complete lies. He wanted proof that couldn't be argued. Proof that didn't depend on emotion. Proof that would continue speaking, even after he no longer could. As I left the courthouse that evening, reporters crowded the front steps. Microphones stretched toward everyone exiting the building. Questions echoed across the entrance. Miss Holloway, do you believe today's testimony changes the case? Do you have any comment regarding Mrs. Holloway's emails? I kept walking. For years, people had wanted my version of the story. Now, the documents were telling it far better than I ever could. Preston, for his part, said almost nothing throughout the entire process. His attorneys had advised him from the beginning that silence was safer than explanation, and for months he followed that advice with remarkable discipline. Every appearance was brief, every answer carefully measured, every public statement reduced to the same sentence. My client denies all wrongdoing. It was repeated so often that news anchors eventually began finishing it before the attorneys did. But evidence has a patience that public statements never possess. Boxes of financial records continued arriving. Bank officials testified. Corporate compliance officers explained transfer thresholds to the jury. Digital forensic specialists reconstructed deleted emails Preston believed had disappeared years earlier. Every week, another piece of the structure my father had uncovered became visible, and every week the space left for denial became smaller. I attended exactly 1 full week of Preston's trial. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted certainty. Hatred had occupied enough of my life already. I wanted facts. The prosecution built the case methodically. They didn't portray Preston as reckless. That would have been inaccurate. They portrayed him as disciplined, patient, deliberate. A man who understood that stealing $1 at a time often attracts less attention than stealing $1 million all at once. Arthur testified for nearly 6 hours. He stood before a projection screen displaying hundreds of transactions connected by lines that crossed the image like an elaborate web. To most people, it looked impossibly complicated. To accountants, it looked intentional. He explained how money moved through Meridian Holdings before disappearing into 4 separate shell companies registered across 3 states. Each transfer remained below mandatory reporting thresholds. Each company owned a minority interest in another. Each layer existed for one purpose: to ensure no single regulator could immediately see the entire structure. Arthur never raised his voice. He never needed to. Evidence rarely benefits from emotion. At one point, Preston's attorney stood and asked whether the transfers might simply represent aggressive corporate tax planning rather than fraud. Arthur smiled politely. It could have, he answered, if the money had ever returned. The courtroom became silent. It didn't. That single sentence seemed to end an entire line of defense. Another witness explained the forged authorization signatures. The differences were almost invisible to the human eye. Tiny changes, pressure points, stroke direction, microscopic hesitations where my father's signature flowed naturally. The specialist enlarged both signatures until they filled the courtroom screen. Even someone with no financial background could see the difference. One had been written, the other imitated. Then came the final witness. The private investigator my father had hired 18 months before his death. He produced photographs, meeting records, hotel receipts, surveillance logs, everything my father had quietly collected while pretending the estrangement between us was real. As I listened, one realization refused to leave me. For 7 years, my father had carried this burden completely alone. He had attended board meetings, shared dinner with Renata, shaken Preston's hand, all while quietly documenting the people slowly dismantling the company he'd spent his entire life building. The loneliness of that thought hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. The verdict came late on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The courtroom filled long before the judge entered. No one spoke above a whisper. Even reporters seemed unusually restrained. When the clerk asked the foreperson whether the jury had reached a verdict, the answer came immediately. We have. Every heartbeat seemed suddenly louder. The foreperson unfolded a single sheet of paper. On count 1, financial fraud. Guilty. No visible reaction crossed Preston's face. The second count followed. Guilty. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. By the time the 11th count had been read aloud, the courtroom no longer sounded surprised, only tired, as though everyone present understood they had just witnessed the inevitable conclusion to a story that had actually ended years earlier, the moment my father decided to begin collecting evidence instead of confronting accusations with assumptions. The judge adjusted his glasses before speaking. Mr. Preston, the sophistication of this scheme required years of planning, extraordinary patience, and repeated acts of deception against individuals who placed exceptional trust in you. He paused. The court therefore finds a substantial custodial sentence both appropriate and necessary. Preston finally looked up. For the first time since the trial began, our eyes met. I expected anger, resentment, perhaps even hatred. Instead, I saw exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years remembering every lie he'd ever told, only to discover the truth required no such effort. He was sentenced to serve the better part of a decade in federal prison. I did not celebrate. There are victories that don't feel like victories. This was one of them. As deputies escorted him from the courtroom, reporters rushed toward the exits, eager to be the first to announce the sentence. I remained seated until nearly everyone had left. Arthur quietly gathered his files beside me. Your father would have been proud, he said. I looked toward the empty witness stand. I hope so. Arthur shook his head gently. No, I don't think you understand. He already was. Renata's trial lasted considerably longer than Preston's. Not because the evidence against her was weaker, because she fought every single piece of it. Where Preston had eventually accepted silence, Renata continued constructing explanations. Every email had been misunderstood, every signature taken out of context, every financial transfer handled by someone else. Listening to weeks of testimony, I came to understand something that had taken me years to learn outside a courtroom as well. Some people don't lie because they believe they'll be believed. They lie because admitting the truth would require them to become someone they no longer know how to be. Her attorneys argued that she had simply trusted her son, that she had never involved herself in corporate finances, that she had signed documents without understanding their significance. It might have worked if my father had not spent 7 years preparing for exactly those arguments. The prosecution introduced journal after journal from my father's private study. Unlike the recorder played at the funeral, these had never been intended for public hearing. They were investigative notes, observations, questions, dates. Every entry written in the same neat handwriting I had finally seen again after so many years. One passage stayed with me more than any other. If I accuse them too early, they destroy the evidence. If I wait too long, they destroy the company. There must be a point between those two outcomes. I only hope I find it before time finds me. Reading those words hurt in a way I hadn't expected. My father had never been choosing between me and them. He had been choosing between impossible outcomes. Every decision carried a cost. He had simply decided to pay it himself. The investigators then presented something Renata had clearly never expected anyone to discover. A safety deposit box, registered under a different surname she had used nearly 20 years earlier. Inside were incorporation documents connecting one of her previous shell companies to the earliest formation records of Meridian Holdings. The chain was finally complete. Not speculation, not theory, documentation, original signatures, bank authorizations, corporate seals. Every missing piece my father had suspected but never lived long enough to uncover. When the evidence appeared on the courtroom screens, I watched Renata carefully. For the first time since the funeral, she stopped pretending. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Her expression softened, not with regret, with resignation. She understood the performance was over. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom filled once again with reporters, attorneys, former employees, and people whose lives had been touched by Holloway Manufacturing in one way or another. The foreperson stood. We find the defendant guilty. The first count was followed by another, then another. Financial fraud, conspiracy, forgery, money laundering. Each verdict landed quietly. Justice rarely sounds dramatic inside a courtroom. It sounds like paperwork. The judge spoke for several minutes before imposing sentence. He described the extraordinary breach of trust, the years of calculated deception, the deliberate exploitation of marriage, family, and corporate authority for personal gain. Then he looked directly at Renata. Mrs. Holloway, this court has seen many financial crimes. Few have required this level of patience. Fewer still have required this level of betrayal. The sentence reflected both. As deputies escorted her toward the side door, she paused. For just a moment, she turned toward me. 7 years earlier, outside St. Miriam's Church, she had looked at me with complete certainty. Certain she had won. Certain my father's silence belonged to her. Now there was no certainty left. Only the quiet realization that the man she believed she had deceived had spent 7 years seeing everything. She held my gaze for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. So, her voice was barely above a whisper. He really never told you. I shook my head. No. She looked down briefly, almost thoughtfully. Then she gave the smallest nod. I wondered. Those were the last words I ever heard her speak. She disappeared through the courtroom doors without looking back. I remained seated long after everyone else began leaving. The reporters hurried outside. Attorneys packed their files. Court officers prepared the room for the next case. Arthur eventually walked over carrying his familiar leather briefcase. It's finished, he said quietly. I looked around the nearly empty courtroom. Finished. The word felt strange. Because justice had arrived. But grief. Grief doesn't end when a verdict is read. It simply becomes quieter. I thought about my father. About the 7 birthdays. 7 Christmas cards. 7 years of believing I'd been abandoned. Nothing could return those years. No court could restore them. No sentence could repay them. Yet something had changed. The story I had carried for so long no longer belonged to me. The truth finally did. And for the first time since walking away from that dining table 7 years earlier, I was ready to walk back into Holloway Manufacturing, not as the daughter who had been uninvited, but as the daughter my father had trusted all along. Taking over Holloway Manufacturing was nothing like I had imagined during the countless nights I'd spent convincing myself I no longer wanted anything to do with it. There were no triumphant speeches, no applause, no sense that justice had somehow erased everything that had come before. There was simply work, boxes of documents still waiting to be reviewed, departments struggling to regain confidence after nearly a decade of quiet uncertainty. Employees wondering whether the company Richard Holloway had built would survive becoming the company his daughter inherited. On my first morning as chief executive officer, I arrived 45 minutes early. Old habits are difficult to abandon. The lobby looked almost exactly as it had the day I'd left 7 years earlier. The marble floor still reflected the morning sunlight. The reception desk remained in the same place. Even the grandfather clock near the elevators continued marking time with the same steady rhythm I remembered from childhood. Only one thing had changed. This time, I belonged there. Several employees looked up as I entered. Some recognized me immediately. Others recognized only my last name. A few looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether they should apologize for believing the story they had carried for 7 years. I made the decision for them. I smiled. I wished them good morning. Then I walked upstairs. The office my father had occupied for nearly 3 decades remained almost untouched. His reading glasses still rested beside a neatly organized stack of reports. A fountain pen lay exactly where he'd apparently left it after signing his final documents. His jacket still hung behind the office door. For several minutes, I simply stood there, not because I didn't know what to do, because the room still felt as though he might walk back into it at any moment. Eventually, I crossed to his desk. Inside the top drawer, exactly where I'd expected, was the small calculator he'd carried everywhere since I was a little girl. He used to joke that people trusted computers too much. "Always verify the numbers yourself," he would say. I slipped the calculator into my bag. Some things belong with family. The first board meeting began at 9 o'clock. Several directors appeared nervous. One or two avoided eye contact altogether. Others welcomed me with quiet sincerity. Before anyone could begin discussing quarterly projections, I placed my father's final handwritten letter on the conference table. "I don't intend to lead this company by pretending the last 7 years never happened," I said. "But neither will I allow those years to define the next 30. No one interrupted. "We're not here to rebuild a reputation. We're here to rebuild trust." The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. For the first time in years, discussions centered on employees, customers, suppliers, and long-term growth instead of hidden ownership structures and suspicious transfers. It felt normal. I hadn't realized how extraordinary normal could feel. Over the following months, I made only a handful of significant changes. Every financial approval required 2 independent authorizations. Outside audits became mandatory every year. Anonymous reporting systems were expanded. No executive, including myself, received authority without oversight. Some investors questioned the additional expense. I remembered my father's words. "Trust isn't built by hoping people behave honestly. It's built by making dishonesty difficult." Within a year, Holloway Manufacturing returned to profitability. Not because of me alone, because hundreds of honest people had been waiting years for the opportunity to work without fear. Denise became Chief Financial Officer. The day I offered her the position, she laughed. "I thought I was interviewing for a bookkeeping job." "So did I answered. She accepted anyway. Watching her sit across the same boardroom table where Preston once believed he controlled the future reminded me how strangely life rewards integrity. Competence had finally found the place it deserved. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the trial ended, Arthur visited my office carrying a single folder. "No financial reports today," he said. Instead, he handed me a photograph. It showed my father standing beside the very first leased warehouse Holloway Manufacturing had ever occupied. His sleeves were rolled up. The building behind him looked far too small to contain the future he imagined. Written across the back, in his handwriting, were 6 words. "Every honest beginning looks impossibly small." I framed the photograph. It still hangs behind my desk. Visitors often ask about it. Most assume it's there because Richard Holloway founded the company. They're only partly right. It's there because the greatest thing my father ever built wasn't a manufacturing business. It was proof that integrity can outlive deception. People still ask me, from time to time, what happened between my father and me. The story has changed over the years. Rumors eventually disappeared, replaced by facts. But my answer has become much shorter. I misunderstood him. Sometimes they ask whether I regret those 7 years. Every single day, I regret the birthdays, the Christmas cards I left unopened, the anger, the silence, the conversations we never had. But regret, I've learned, is not the same as bitterness. Bitterness asks us to live in the past. Regret asks us to live differently. I chose the second. Every Christmas now, Holloway Manufacturing sends handwritten cards to every retired employee. Not printed signatures. Real ones. Every birthday, flowers arrive for employees celebrating milestone years with the company. White lilies. Most people never ask why I chose them. Those who know, never need to. Sometimes, late in the evening after everyone else has gone home, I sit alone in my father's office overlooking the factory floor. The machines continue running. Forklifts move between loading bays. Workers finish another ordinary day. Life continues. Exactly as it should. I often think back to that November dinner. For years, I believed it was the night my father stopped loving me. Now I understand it was the night he loved me enough to let the entire world hate him for it. That knowledge can never return the years we lost. But it gave me something infinitely more valuable. The truth. And truth, unlike deception, asks for only one thing in return. The courage to carry it forward. When visitors walk through Holloway Manufacturing today, they see a successful company. They see modern equipment, strong financial reports, a respected name. They don't see the 7 years of silence that made its survival possible. They don't hear the voice of a father echoing through a small church on a rainy Saturday morning. They don't know that one recorded confession restored far more than an inheritance. It restored a daughter. And every time I pass the framed photograph behind my desk, I smile. Not because the story ended happily, but because it ended truthfully. Sometimes, that's the greatest victory any family can hope for.